You know, in The Shining, when they're in the like, ballroom,
Yeah,
ghosts around, it was kind of like that, which is quite sort of spooky stuff, I think.
it might be quite good for a misanthropic playlist.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Thoughts. I'm Ross.
And I'm Katie.
In this episode, we speak to Dr. Ian Kidd, who's an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Nottingham. We speak about misanthropy, which is the moral condemnation of humanity, why it's a good view and what its place is in philosophy. Here are some thoughts on misanthropy. Okay, Ian, welcome to the show. Thanks very much for joining us.
Real pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
So today we're going to be talking about philosophical misanthropy. Why don't we start by giving us, maybe give us a rough definition or how you're thinking of the concept?
Well, usually if you look at misanthropy in a dictionary, you get a definition that emphasizes something like hatred of humankind or hatred of humanity or a disgust at human existence. Now, that would make it a very unattractive doctrine. So that's not what I have in mind by a philosophical misanthropy. I mean by it very generally, systematic moral condemnation of humankind as it's come to be. So it doesn't necessarily involve hatred. It doesn't necessarily target individual persons. The misanthrope is condemning the collective moral character of humankind as a whole. And that's the core around which I want to build an account of philosophical misanthropy.
Okay, so it's consistent to like individuals and have friends, but still be a misanthrope.
Oh, yes, definitely. And I think if you look at some of the great misanthropes of history, that was clearly their attitude. So the writer Jonathan Swift, he has this very nice remark that he says, I hate and loathe this writhing mass called humankind. But he says, I have great affection for Tom and Dick and Harry. And the reason he gives is very instructive. He says, some of the people that I love and esteem in the world, I love and esteem precisely because they are relatively free of the failings and vices that tend to infect the mass. Those people of unusual kindness, generosity, and sympathy, which just contrast with the selfishness, meanness, and callousness of the whole. So it's perfectly consistent that the misanthrope would like and admire and even love certain people. But for the misanthrope, it will be because they're so unlike the writhing mass of the rest of us.
Okay, that's good news. We can still be friends, Ross. You'll be glad to hear.
I was really worried for a second there, so that's great.
I thought you might be. So is there kind of a threshold level of badness then that justifies a misanthropic view? Like, do you have to have some sort of balance? Like, is it 50-50 is okay, or like a bit more bad than good?
Well, it's interesting that the misanthropes don't tend to go for those sorts of kind of calculative arguments. I think for many misanthropes, their attitude is simply that if you take a really honest, sober look at the moral character and performance of humankind, or at specific sections of it, like one's own culture, they think it's just pretty clear overall that we are more bad than worse. What they usually do, instead of giving the sort of empirical arguments you describe, they'll offer a range of auxiliary arguments whose function is to sort of boost up the misanthropic judgment by trying to remove various arguments people use to present us as morally better than they are. So if I think about some of the great misanthropes of history, like Kant and Schopenhauer, they will emphasize that actually we don't have names for many of our vices and failings. And so in a sense, we're undercounting our vices because some of them just aren't parts of our inherited vocabulary of the vices. They'll also emphasize, as Sartre did, that we have these strong dispositions to bad faith, that we are very, very skilled individually and collectively at explaining away our vices. So I'm not arrogant, I'm confident, I'm not harsh, I'm direct. And they'll point to these sorts of arguments which try to weaken the misanthropic judgment. They'll also point out various ways that human beings try to resist the misanthropic judgment by trying to confine it, by saying, well, sure, there are extremely vicious people who are cruel, arrogant, violent, and mendacious, but those sorts of vices only really appear in extreme conditions like political displacement or civil war. Or they're really confined to certain extreme people like psychopaths and moral monsters. And of course, the function of those confinement strategies is to say, well, it's not human being as such that has vices and failings. It's only certain human beings under certain conditions. And I think that's the way that the misanthrope prefers to argue, not by, as it were, counting our vices and failings, but by trying to strip away the arguments that present us as much more morally attractive than we actually are.
Yeah, So you kind of touched upon it there, but I think it's really interesting, so I wanted to ask more about it. So you kind of mentioned among misanthropes, there's different kind of ways to embody that view. There's different kind of ways to go about it in your day-to-day life. Could you say a bit more about those, the kind of different ways you could go about embodying being a misanthrope in your life?
Sure. So the one disadvantage of there not being very much literature on misanthropy is that no one's yet sat down to do the taxonomic work of analyzing the concept of misanthropy and working out the different ways to be one. And one thing that became very clear to me when I started to work on misanthropy is that there are very many ways of being a misanthrope. So I mentioned that dictionary definition that misanthropy is concerned with hatred and violence against humankind. Now, that concept was introduced by Kant, who describes a type of misanthrope he calls the enemy of humankind, who's dominated by enmity, this combination of dislike of human beings and ill will. And he says that misanthrope is hateful and violent. They want to destroy human life, tear down civilization, and so on. But Kant also identifies a second type of misanthrope, which is the fugitive from mankind. And this misanthrope, he says, is dominated by fear of humankind, of the physical risks of being amongst them, of the moral dangers of corruption if you remain part of their world, and so on. And their characteristic behavior is flight. It's to escape the human world into a distant country or an isolated valley, or off into a monastery. So there already you have two types of misanthrope. And I think if you look more broadly, you find at least two others. So there is what I call the activist misanthrope. That's someone, I think, like Confucius, who recognizes that humankind is systematically morally awful, but their response is, as it were, to roll up their sleeves and to do the moral work to try to effect some collective transformation of our moral character. So in the case of Confucius, that involved decades of recruiting disciples, teaching and preaching, traveling around China, trying to communicate with rulers to give advice, to restore respect for the rights and tradition. And for Confucius, the correct response to our collective awfulness is to try to make us better through grand, ambitious projects. So there's a third type. And then the final, fourth type of misanthrope is a quietist. And this is the misanthrope who thinks, again, that we are collectively morally awful, but really nothing can be done about this. So maybe they think that just practically nothing could be done, that our vices are too entrenched, our failings are too pronounced, or they think that anything that we did try to do on a large scale would have terrible backfire risks, that in our efforts to transform the world for the better, we're just going to supercharge our arrogance, hubris, and vainglory. And that's the attitude of someone like Zhuangzi, the Taoist. He thinks that the world is collectively awful, but nothing could be done about this. So the best thing to do is to try to accommodate to our collective failings, to live inconspicuously, to avoid the more corrupting areas of human life, certain professions or certain places, to cultivate virtues of quietude and restraint, like modesty, and crudely, just to keep your head down, try to protect your moral character and live out as good a human life as you can under these conditions. So there are four types of misanthrope: enemies, fugitives, activists, and quietists. And no doubt there are others as well that are less pronounced or less common. So there's one further type of misanthrope tucked away in one of Kant's writings. He doesn't give a name to it, but one of the scholars calls it the virtuous solitary. And this is a person who's a combination of, I think, the quietist and the fugitive. They retain a love of humankind, says Kant, but they recognize that if they stay amongst us, it will just damage their trust and love in humankind. And so they engage in these painful periods of retreat. They morally rejuvenate, they restore that fragile trust, and they take a deep breath, go back into the human world, and then pull out again. So you can also mix and match the stances. I don't want to be as crude as saying these are the four stances and they're all rigidly separate. In fact, in the book I'm writing, my conclusion will be that what you really find amongst very reflective misanthropes is a sort of predicament, where the real challenge is not choosing a stance and sticking with it. It's being caught in this very painful oscillation between different stances. And it's that misanthropic predicament, I think, that's really genuine. So there are at least many different ways of being a misanthrope. And I think the real philosophical interest in misanthropy is how a person copes emotionally and existentially when they're caught between these different stances, and trying to answer this very existentially charged question: once you internalize this vision of the world, how do you live anything like a still meaningful, satisfying human life?
I think it's kind of interesting because those four stances I feel kind of highlight like maybe the question of why you'd be motivated to adopt a misanthropic stance. Because so if you're going to be an activist, then fair enough, maybe it's quite pragmatic and it's going to help you make the world better. But if you're a quietist, you're probably not. And it seems like you'd be happier if you weren't, probably, if you're sort of hopelessly, ridiculously optimistic. So is it more about accurately perceiving the world, or is it kind of pragmatic, like you think it's a useful tool for progressing morally?
That's where there's a lot of work to do in locating those different misanthropic stances in their proper context. So of course, a misanthrope is never just going to be a misanthrope. They will always be embedded in a certain context or tradition. They will have background moral values and beliefs. And that will, to a degree, shape the sorts of stances that one could adopt. So Kant, for example, is very clear that the enemy stance is, in his sense, contemptible and hateful because it involves necessarily an attitude of hatefulness towards human beings, which he can't accept, I think partly for Christian reasons, and also attitudes of violence. So for Kant, the enemy stance is ruled out because of certain background moral and religious commitments he has. Likewise, I think the Taoists are inevitably committed to some form of quietism, given background features of their wider philosophical convictions. For example, the emphasis upon virtues of quietude like simplicity and restraint, the constant warnings in the Taoist texts against getting entangled with the world and caught up in grand schemes. I mean, that doesn't determine that they will be quietists, but it does point them in that direction. Likewise with Confucius, I mean, there are strong reasons within Confucian philosophy why you would want to be a sort of activist. There's the strongly communitarian character of their philosophy. There is Confucius's profound faith that their inherited moral and cultural tradition provides enormous resources for moral rejuvenation. And he also has the confidence that we can restore humankind to a morally outstanding condition because, in his view of history, well, we did that in the past, back in the age of the Sage Kings. We did it once, we can do it again. And so Confucius has particular resources that would justify forms of optimism. And a lot of the work, I think, of studying misanthropy is to try to locate it relative to the particular philosophies and contexts that you're studying. For example, Christian misanthropy is highly shaped often by doctrines of original sin. That will shape the flavor of the misanthropy available to you. It will determine the sorts of emotions and attitudes you want to build into your misanthropy. It will affect the sorts of behaviors that will be salient to you. And that's part of why I think misanthropy was a very interesting project for historians of philosophy. You can reinterpret certain philosophers in misanthropic terms, like Confucius. I mean, that's not an orthodox reading of him at all. But also you can see how these philosophies and these forms of misanthropy grow and take shape within particular philosophical and cultural traditions.
So in your work, you mentioned a lot of like Taoist and Buddhist philosophy, and it's probably fair to say is like, unfortunately, not that common in like Western analytic tradition. Could you I think that's really interesting. Could you say a bit more about how you kind of came across that or how you find that useful for your own work?
Well, my own philosophical starting point for misanthropy was a book by my former Durham colleague, David Cooper, a very short, sharp book called Animals and Misanthropy. And as the title suggests, David makes the claim that, honest, sober reflection on contemporary humankind's treatment of and relationships to animals justifies a profound charge of misanthropy. And in the book, he has a variety of arguments that he deploys to make this, but he draws a lot upon cross-cultural philosophical traditions. And he was my teacher at Durham. And one of the things that he'd always just naturally instilled in me is, if you want to do certain kinds of project in philosophy, you really have to go cross-cultural. I mean, not necessarily the case that all philosophers have to be conversant with, Zhuangzi and the Mohists and Nagarjuna and so on. But he said there are certain projects that just naturally invite, if not demand, cross-cultural study. For example, philosophical studies of the nature of the good life have not been confined to the Western tradition. I mean, sure, the Greeks have a lot to say about this, but so do the ancient Indians and the ancient Chinese and the Native Americans and so on. And that just naturally encouraged me since my undergraduate days, this comparative or pluralistic or cross-cultural style of philosophy. And certainly, I think when you look at misanthropy, it's very, very useful to go cross-cultural. And that's not to say that there's nothing to be learned in the Western misanthropic traditions. There is, but you'll get particular forms of misanthropy rather than, a properly synoptic view of all the possible forms it could take across different cultures. And that's why, over my philosophical career, I just tried to develop at least a working understanding of those different philosophical traditions. And of course, in my experience, the best way to learn those traditions is to teach them to students. That's by far the best way to develop a working understanding of any area of philosophy. Get a room full of informed, engaged students and have them help you learn.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think it's definitely not done enough in general, is it? But I think that's I don't know, I think you can just kind of learn so much more about like these kind of narrow topics you tend to get really deep into by kind of looking at different ways of approaching it from the get-go. I think that's definitely not done enough. I know that's something you do in your own work, but yeah. Okay, did you have something on that?
Not on that in particular. I was just going to ask you. You like sort of mentioned quite a lot about, you sort of draw parallels between feminist theory and misanthropy, and then also asked you towards, I completely forgotten the word, like ecology, but like, you know what I mean?
You'd be like environmentalism, that sort of.
Yeah, environmentalism, of course. How can I not think of that? Jesus.
So one of the things it's useful to do when you try to introduce misanthropy to people is to introduce them to closely related doctrines. So when I've given talks on misanthropy, I found that one thing that's very effective for getting people into it is to introduce them to certain styles of what I would call eco-misanthropy. So there's a very, very dominant rhetoric in a lot of academic and popular environmentalism, according to which human beings are just a destructive species, we are a virus, we are a cancer, we are a hugely destructive force in the world. And it's quite interesting that when environmentalists try to articulate that judgment, they say that human beings as a whole are aggressive, rapacious, merciless, destructive. And in my thinking, what they're describing is a misanthropic condemnation of humankind. It's very specifically motivated by our engagements with the natural world. But what they're emphasizing is that humankind, as it's come to be, is premised upon the systematic exploitation and destruction of natural creatures, places, and processes. And they're making a misanthropic judgment. And I find that at least many of my students and many of the audiences I've spoken to, that immediately resonates with them because they tend to agree with the judgment. They wouldn't recognize it as misanthropic, but once you introduce them to the idea that what the environmentalists are doing is systematic moral condemnation of humankind, of its structures, ambitions, and practices, and it's morally articulated in terms of vices and failings, they get it. That's their way into misanthropy. Now, one limitation of this is that focusing upon environmental or eco-misanthropy only covers certain of our failings. And I suppose what the misanthrope wants to do is to say, well, the eco-misanthrope covers some of the bases, critically speaking, but there are many, many others. For example, there are certain vices and failings that show up, not in our treatment of animals and natural places, but for example, our treatment of various marginalized populations within our societies. And that's where at the moment I'm trying to do more work understanding how feminism relates to misanthropy. So I would think about many forms of feminist critique as a particular way into misanthropy, where here the emphasis is upon a different variety of vices and failings also embedded in our structures and practices, whose target will be women or various marginalized and oppressed groups, racial minorities. I think that if you have a properly complexly developed intersectional feminist critique of contemporary structures of patriarchy, heteronormativity, structural racism, that gives you another way into misanthropy. Again, it's drawing out a different set of failings like unfairness, exploitativeness, cruelty, arrogance, dogmatism. But what you're doing with these different ways into misanthropy is introducing people to a properly broad array of vices and failings. And I suppose in the book, the claim is that there are many ways into misanthropy, but the end goal of eco-misanthropy or these styles of feminist critique will be something like a comprehensive, systematic condemnation of humankind. And here, one of the interesting questions will be, what sorts of moral theories and moral failings do you want to pick out? So there might be a considerable consensus on, a certain range of human vices and failings, like everyone will list arrogance, cruelty, dogmatism, selfishness, myopia, and so on. But there are lots and lots of vices and failings. And one thing about misanthropes is that they love lists. I mean, the Buddhists, the Protestants, they have enormous lists and catalogues of our vices and failings. And the Buddhist list in particular are remarkable. The 16 types of arrogance, the 14 types of cruelty, the 9 types of this vice and that vice. And a good question for the misanthrope is, well, what vices are salient to you? So when I speak to my students, they're typically very tuned into, I suppose, what you might call vices of social injustice, like unfairness and discriminativeness. And they're very tuned into vices of environmental destruction, like exploitativeness and unsustainability. But there are other vices that just don't show up for them, like banality or insensibility, vices they might not have heard of. And in more interesting cases, there are certain vices and failings that many people just wouldn't regard as vices and failings. So there's a small literature in contemporary Christian misanthropy, where an important part of the condemnation of humankind is emphasizing our godlessness, about the moral failings built into something like atheistic secular culture. The fact, for instance, that people nowadays will openly live lives not structured by a relationship to God. Now, for many people, that's not a sign of moral failing. That's an attractive sign of the moral development of a liberal secular society. But for certain communities, that itself is a sign of the systematic godlessness of humankind, which is itself an important component of misanthropy. And in my work, I don't really want to adjudicate these claims. I just want to lay out the forms of misanthropy. But it is very important to me that, if you put a load of misanthropes in a room, they might agree on the general features that humankind is morally awful, but the devil is always in the details. So many of my students were just astonished by the idea that you could regard our collective secular godlessness as a sign for moral horror. But of course, when you introduce them to relevant literatures, they see it. So misanthropy is highly pluralistic and in a certain sense disunified, but that's what you would expect of an extremely morally diverse global human community.
That's interesting. So it does have to be based on some sort of moral, well, not theory, but some sort of like moral understanding that you hold yourself.
I think because crucially, misanthropy is a moral condemnation of humankind. And of course, condemnation needs terms and criteria. I mean, one could just say humankind's morally awful. You can use metaphors like we're a virus or a cancer, the worst thing that's ever happened in human history. Sure. But what you really want philosophically is some terms of condemnation, rather like a legal charge of a crime. And, in my experience, most misanthropes of the philosophical sort tend to go for some sort of vice theory, because of course what virtues and vices give to you is a very specific, complex, fine-grained account of the various wrongs of humankind. So Kant, Schopenhauer, the Buddha, and so on, they naturally reach for a vocabulary of vices and failings, because you could say humankind has abandoned its duties or is bad, but those are quite thin moral terms, really. You want the nice, thick, detailed moral terms and the specific terms of condemnation given to you by vice theory. And I think once you plug misanthropy into vice theory, as David Cooper does, then you can really articulate in complex detail this moral condemnation of humankind.
You kind of touched upon it there again, but I was wondering more about some of the benefits of adopting a misanthropist sort of view. So I think you touched upon, I think you were mentioning Judith Shklar's work, sorry if I've not pronounced that right, about like the epistemic use of adopting a misanthropist view. Can you say a bit more about that, how it might be beneficial epistemically?
Yeah, so Shklar has quite a nice discussion of misanthropy in her book, Ordinary Vices. I think to a degree her discussion is limited by the fact that she conflates misanthropy with the enemy stance. And so when she warns against the dangers of misanthropy, which interestingly she thinks is a vice, she thinks that, well, because it leads to hate and violence, it's going to be a bad influence in human life. But she does, as you say, make those remarks that there can be an advantage to misanthropy. Two that she mentions that are quite interesting. She says, one is that the misanthrope can serve the useful function of calling our attention to certain patterns and tendencies in our behavior that we might naturally ignore or skirt over. So, of course, a misanthrope will be sort of naturally tuned into people's vices and failings. So they won't be inclined to just dismiss or explain away people's vices and failings. They will perceive them as parts of wider patterns of human failings. And that would have an epistemic value. It would teach us more about individual and collective human behavior. And that in itself is morally instructive. We learn more about our moral world if we have a little bit of misanthropy in our vision of things. And a second type of epistemic advantage she discusses is that it can teach us a little bit more about the complexity and variety of human failings. So one aim of that book of hers, Ordinary Vices, is, I suppose, to try to correct certain misconceptions that she thinks have crept into our moral thinking about the world. So even the title concept, Ordinary Vices, now that's taken from Montaigne. And one of the points that she and Montaigne want to emphasize is that it's a mistake to think about our vices as being confined to certain rare extreme events. She says a lot of our vices are just very ordinary in the sense that they show up in ordinary everyday practices, almost banal everyday practices. So Shklar has a nice discussion of cruelty. And she says this might be shown in dramatic, horrible events like, beating an animal, but there are lots of what one might call micro cruelties just woven into everyday thought and behavior. And I suppose what she's emphasizing is what David Cooper calls the ubiquity of vices, the ways that they are constantly spread throughout the world in ordinary, everyday, small situations, behaviors, and attitudes. And a nice contemporary way to think about this would be to look at a phenomenon like microaggressions, the ways that a lot of misogynistic and sexist behavior is not confined to like large, appalling, dramatic actions. It's in the smallest of everyday behaviors, phrases, right down to levels of bodily behaviors like forms of eye contact, bodily demeanor. And that's another advantage then of misanthropy for Shklar. It can teach us a lot about our vices and what they are and how to theorize about them. And I entirely agree with both of those. I think misanthropy can teach us a lot about our moral communities and about concepts like vices and corruption and flourishing. And I think that you could probably extend this list as well into other advantages that misanthropy can have. And I suppose that turns on a deep question, which is, well, if misanthropy is true, if it's accurate in its appraisal of humankind, well, should you broadcast it to people? Should you get out there and spread the news? I mean, there is an alethic argument which goes, if it does register a very deep fundamental truth about the world, then yes, you should communicate it. And that's an argument that I think is there in Schopenhauer. But I think a more interesting question is, well, what would be the pragmatic advantages of broadcasting the truth of misanthropy? Because one can very easily imagine many people reacting very badly. And, someone might say, well, look, if you're right in your judgment that collectively we're all absolutely morally awful, then, well, okay, well, I'm just going to give up then. If we are, collectively doomed to be cruel, violent, and selfish, well, that's my weekend sorted then. And people will exploit the doctrine to go out there and do appalling things because it will have a licensing effect on our behavior. And of course, that's not something that the misanthrope wants, unless they're of the enemy sort. And I think there's a very tricky moral and pragmatic question then about balancing the potential epistemic and practical benefits of a form of misanthropy with the significant risks built into broadcasting it.
Yeah, so while we were talking about the kind of pragmatic considerations of adopting like a misanthropist view about whether we can convince people or whether that would even be the right thing to do, I was also thinking like on a kind of first person, like personal level, could it just be the case that even if it's completely accurate and really informative and just the right view to hold about the world in general, that there might be like reasons to just not adopt it anyway? So like I'm thinking of like certain kinds of meditation or even therapy where we're just kind of taught that it might be a good thing not to kind of cultivate or manifest negative attitudes or dispositions towards anything just for your own benefit, even if it's completely justified and correct, all things considered. Would something like that maybe like, could there be not an objection, but something like a worry lurking for the misanthropist there that it might just be not worthwhile taking up the view, even if it's correct?
I think there are two thoughts in response to that. I mean, one is that the process of becoming a philosophical misanthrope is clearly going to be emotionally and psychologically, as well as philosophically, very, very difficult. So Kant has this really rather moving account of the process of becoming a misanthrope. And it's one of the nicer, more readable passages of Kant, actually. And he says, misanthropy will typically begin with what he calls long, sad experiences of people's vices and failings, experiences of pain, humiliation, regret, upset, that over time start to fracture our trust and damage our moral confidence in the world. And over time, he says, these long, sad experiences will provoke certain reflections and forms of uncertainty, which over time can modulate into an increasingly transformed perception of the world, what Schopenhauer calls a mood of melancholy. But one thing that Kant and Schopenhauer both emphasize is that these kind of inner processes and these melancholic moods are very, very difficult to bear, and they should be very carefully, very gingerly dealt with. And I suppose the thought they have in the background is that the misanthropic vision of the world will typically be quite different from your prior vision of the world, one which you'll increasingly come to see as quite morally naive, and for which you're therefore not psychologically prepared. And that means that you shouldn't rush into it. You should not resist the truth of misanthropy, but it's quite a bitter pill to swallow. And it's best if you gradually move into that vision of the world slowly and carefully, where the carefulness partly includes trying to build up new forms of emotional and psychological support. Because one thing I, for example, emphasize to my students is that there are certain philosophical doctrines that don't really have any tangible effect upon your life if you accept them. So if I come to adopt a new ontology of objects, according to which there in fact are no objects, there are just, tiny simples, that's not going to in any way affect my practical dealings with the world. I will still drink from my cup, use my pen, type on my computer. But there are different philosophical doctrines that have this emotional and existential effect upon people. So, these are doctrines that, as William James says, they grow hot and alive within you. They force this crystallization that transforms your perception of the world. And as James says, these doctrines are quite momentous, and for that reason shouldn't be handled lightly. And I think misanthropy is one of those momentous doctrines. Once you internalize this vision of the world authentically, it really does transform your perception of other people and how you engage with them. It alters, for example, your interpersonal trust. It fundamentally changes your moral expectations of the human world. It can really transform your relationship to those deep sources of identity and pride and dignity that are grounded in, at a deep level, in something like moral trust in humankind. So Kant is very poignant on this when he emphasizes that misanthropy will damage our confidence in humanitas, this common innate dignity owed to all human beings. And for Kant, that dignity that humanitas grants you is an important part of what it means to live well as a human being. And if that is damaged, it damages something really fundamental. And for that reason, I think the misanthrope should proceed carefully, both in how they internalize and respond to their own misanthropic longings, but also how and if they communicate it to other people. Because it's quite a heavy thing to throw at a person. You have to be sure that they can actually catch and internalize that doctrine. So that'd be the first thought, is that one shouldn't rush into misanthropy. One should take it seriously as this existentially quite disturbing, momentous doctrine. And maybe a second thought is that a misanthrope should not resist the truth of misanthropy, but there are different ways of responding to that misanthropic vision of the world that will be shaped by the stance you have. So if you're a quietist, then, as the name suggests, you might just very quietly internalize this. You might very quickly and very privately reset some of your expectations about human beings. You'll make various changes to your comportment in the world, but your life might carry on broadly as it was before. And those would be, if you like, invisible misanthropes. They have the vision, but in a sense, you would never know. Whereas for, say, those inclined to activism or fugitivism, misanthropy will have far more radical responses, because, when those people internalize misanthropy, they're at a, like the fugitive will be at a real flight risk of just wanting to flee the human world and escape somewhere. Or the activists might set themselves on a path of desperate moral activism and getting out there and trying to change the world. And when I've been talking to misanthropy with my students, it's very clear that part of their apprehension about the doctrine is that they can see its longitudinal effects upon their life. And some of them are quite sanguine because they were quietists by nature, and they're quite happy to live their life making small, inconspicuous adjustments so that you would almost never know they become a misanthrope. Whereas for others, if they internalize misanthropy, they can just feel the inevitable compulsion that they will have to get out there and try to change the world. But now with this damaged trust in human beings, that makes them think that's going to be very, very futile. And I think one thing you see in, again, Confucius's moral activism is a very acute sensitivity to the effects of certain moral beliefs on different types of person. And I think for that reason, a misanthrope should be very careful about how and if at all they broadcast the truth of their misanthropy, because it'd be quite difficult to predict the effects upon yourself and upon other people. And maybe a parallel here would be the experience of many people when they convert to some sort of feminist vision of the world, and they suddenly internalize, a very emotionally and politically charged understanding of the structures in patriarchy that were there all along, that they're now seeing in vivid, horrible detail. Now, that vision will have different effects upon people, and the effects will be very complex. There might be a welcome feeling of finally seeing the truth of the world as it is. There'll be the relief of being able to explain and understand things that had always just been very confusing. But of course, there'll also be a very complex, intermixed structure of despair, frustration, profound anger. And for those reasons, the misanthrope will want to help people to cope with the misanthropic vision of the world, rather than just lumbering them with it and then, as it were, just pissing off and leaving them to cope.
Well, so you mentioned there, these kind of broad Steven Pinker style optimistic views about our moral progress and how much progress we have made. And I really agree, and I'm also very skeptical about that kind of stuff. But I do wonder how a view like yours interacts with views about moral progress, because it doesn't fit well with what someone like Steven Pinker maybe wants to say, but it seems like it could fit nicer, or it seems like not inconsistent with views that say we actually have made some really significant moral progress in a bunch of different really important moral domains, and yet misanthropy is like, we still have such a long way to go, and it's for all the reasons you've articulated going to be really useful to focus on these vices and to kind of, I think you say, like, front load some of the bad things. It's going to have a bunch of good consequences. How do you think of that? I mean, does that sound right in terms of you could adopt that view of moral progress and then still be a kind of misanthrope?
There are a couple of responses the misanthrope would make to kind of progressive philanthropes like Pinker. I mean, one rather gloomy point to make is that, well, of course, yes, we do make certain kinds of moral progress. We overcome certain kinds of vices and failings, but the unfortunate problem is that we then generate new kinds of vices and failings to replace them. And we're in this sort of morally regressive arms race where we overcome one type of, let's say, discrimination or cruelty, only to generate a new one. And Pinker actually is a very good example of this. So in that book of his, The Better Angels of Our Nature, he makes this claim that humankind has improved morally and made, in his terms, marvelous moral progress because of significant declines in violence over history. Now, many historians took issue with this, and one of the good arguments that they make against him is that although there has been a decline in interpersonal violence, what there has also been at the same time is an enormous shift towards forms of institutional and structural violence, about which Pinker is almost silent. So sure, we've overcome one kind of violence, interpersonal violence, where, one person, committing violence against another. Sure, that's gone, but we have massively replaced it with whole new forms of institutional and structural violence. So yes, there's been progress. We've overcome one kind of violence, but only by introducing a new type of violence. So there we can push back and say, well, yes, there was progress, but the failings that we replaced were, replaced in turn with new awful things. So there's one response. We make moral progress and then immediately create new challenges. And that's the vision, I suppose, many misanthropes have, that, the history of moral progress is really just constant whack-a-mole. You defeat one type of moral failure and a new one springs up. Or you overcome one kind of vice, but it takes new forms. And that's where I do quite like certain metaphors of our vices and failings festering and mutating and taking new forms all of the time. So there's one response to the progress arguments. We do make progress, but then the whole thing starts up again. A second kind of response is that those claims about moral progress are typically invested in very, very narrow definitions of what it means to progress. And again, Pinker is a good example here. So he slides very quickly from the global claim, humankind is making moral progress across the board, to a very narrow claim that actually we're becoming less violent. Now, in his book, he does provide, very interesting documentation that we're becoming less interpersonally violent, but there's very little evidence in his book or in general that we're becoming less vain, less selfish, less dishonest, less violent, less mendacious, less exploitative. There's a whole range of vices. And Pinker, I think, tells a very, very narrow story, because the vices of violence are only some of the many, many vices of humankind. And it's not difficult to find historical evidence that actually over time we're becoming more arrogant, more dogmatic, more selfish. And I think the misanthrope's claim is that, well, you can only tell these cheerful progressive stories by focusing upon a very narrow range of our vices with certain sorts of evidence. And I think that's one of the best responses to claims about moral progress. Say, well, if you look at the whole range of our vices and failings, you'd have to show that there were significant declines in all of them, not just in some of them. I mean, I'm very pleased that we're becoming less interpersonally violent, if that's true, which anyway, I'm slightly skeptical about. But still, lots of other vices are flourishing and lots of other vices have come into view, and they're doing very, very well. And it'd be very contemporary here to use sort of virological or epidemiological metaphors here. Like, there are many vices and they're mutating and they're flourishing, and increasingly the structure of the world tend to scaffold them. So sure, we've left behind some forms of vice and failing, but there are still plenty more to be dealing with. And, I suppose that's what eco-misanthropy and certain forms of kind of feminist critique are trying to do. They're trying to make salient other kinds of vices and failings, showing how they're not just contingently built into some of the structures of our life, they are massively built into the whole range of our structures. And that's a sort of rather gloomy moral story that I would want to tell. I mean, we've made small local progress in overcoming some forms of some of our vices and failings, but the real moral situation is far more complex.
I think, unfortunately, we probably will have to wrap up there because we've been talking for an hour now. But Ross, are you a misanthrope now?
I'm convinced, yep, wholeheartedly.
Thank you. We're all misanthropes now. But thank you so much for coming on.
No, it's been a real pleasure. It's surprisingly enjoyable talking about misanthropy.
Yeah, it's been weirdly fun.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Thoughts.
Remember to follow us on Facebook at ThoughtsUFG and on Twitter and Instagram at Thoughts_UFG.
See you next time.